What you will have for a birthday?
No, I want like on the television drums.
It's often the quiet moments, the ones that seem unimportant, that hold the power to shift everything. In a seemingly ordinary classroom, with the hum of chatter and rustling notebooks, something extraordinary was about to happen. Baron Trump, a young man who had always kept to the shadows, was about to make a choice that would ripple through the nation. So let's dive into the story and see how one quiet moment can change everything. Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you. As a professor mockingly spoke about his mother, something inside Baron stirred. This wasn't a moment he could stay silent for. Without warning, he stood up, his words clear and full of conviction. The room froze, and with a single statement, the atmosphere shifted. The professor, known for her sharp words and unwavering beliefs, found herself stunned into silence, a moment that no one saw coming, but one that would resonate deeply, sparking a conversation that spread across America. What was it that broke the silence? What led Baron, always the observer, to speak up in such a way? And how did the professor, so confident in her own views, find herself challenged in an instant? This is a story that asks us to rethink how we see others, how we judge, and how we truly listen. In that lecture hall at Westwood University, students filled the seats, unaware that the day would become unforgettable. Baron, sitting in the third row, had always kept his identity hidden. Just a student among many. But on that day, in that moment, he was about to reveal a strength that no one expected, changing everything with just a few words. Professor Lewis scanned the room, her eyes locking onto the class with a smile that seemed to hold a secret. Good morning. Today we're diving into what truly makes a public image powerful. The energy shifted instantly. Professor Lewis had a way of sparking curiosity, always blending sharp insights with a hint of controversy. In the front row, Jessica Carter, an outstanding student, leaned forward, her sharp eyes betraying her interest. Brilliant and critical, Jessica had always viewed politics through a lens of skepticism. To her, leaders were mere creations, sculpted by PR teams to project a version of reality the public wanted to believe. The truth, she knew, was always more complicated than the picture-perfect images presented on TV. She nudged her friend Mark, who was fiddling with his phone. "Here we go," she whispered. "Wonder who she's going after today." Mark laughed softly, not knowing that today's lesson would be unlike any before. Professor Lewis turned to the board, her hand moving with purpose as she wrote, "Perception versus reality." The room hushed, a tension settling in the air. Something about this felt different, and Baron, sitting quietly in the back, sensed it too. "You see," the professor began, her voice steady, "we often believe the images the media gives us, but how often do we question if they're the truth?" She paused, the weight of her words hanging in the room. Take a public figure, always pristine, reserved, mysterious. Society admires them, but what's the real value? Or is it just a well-crafted illusion? Then she wrote a name on the board, Melania Trump. A murmur rippled through the class. Baron's heart raced. He hadn't expected this. He had hoped for anonymity, but now everything was about to change. Jessica's eyes sparkled with curiosity, and Mark, unaware of the gravity of the moment, casually adjusted his phone. As the professor spoke, Baron knew he could no longer stay in the shadows. Professor Martha Lewis stood in front of the class, her posture rigid, eyes scanning the room with a sharp intensity. She crossed her arms, a small smile curling on her lips. But it wasn't the kind of smile that invited warmth. It was the kind that came just before a sharp jab. "Let's talk about Melania Trump," she began, her voice dripping with subtle sarcasm. A woman celebrated for her elegance, her impeccable appearance. But has she truly contributed anything meaningful to society? The room shifted. A few students chuckled nervously, while others exchanged curious glances, wondering where this was going. Baron, sitting at the back, clenched his fists beneath the desk. His heart raced, but he knew better than to react too quickly. In the front row, Jessica raised an eyebrow. "This should be interesting," she muttered, eager for the drama to unfold. Professor Lewis moved to the board and wrote two words in large, bold letters: image and substance. She turned back to the class, her eyes gleaming with challenge. "We live in a world where image often speaks louder than substance," she continued. Melania Trump, admired for her grace, but is she truly a role model? A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. "Let's look at the facts," Professor Lewis pressed. "Our First Lady, often praised for her poise, but whose speeches were overshadowed by critiques of her accent. A woman who launched a campaign against bullying.
First Lady Melania Trump announcing her new campaign against online bullying. Her message to kids, be best.
Yet married to a man notorious for his own inflammatory words on social media." Laughter erupted from the back. Mark, always looking for a viral moment, subtly raised his phone to capture the unfolding scene. It was clear to him, this conversation was taking a turn. Jessica nodded thoughtfully, her chin resting in her hand. She makes a good point. We're so quick to admire those with a polished image, but how much of it is just media manipulation? A voice from the back spoke up. "Are you saying we should judge people based on what they actually do, not just how they appear in public?" "Exactly," Professor Lewis affirmed, her eyes lighting up as the room buzzed with discussion. Some students leaned forward, eager to debate, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But in the midst of the noise, Barron remained still, his expression hard as stone. The words felt like daggers, cutting into him, into a part of him that few knew. He wanted to defend his mother, a woman who had come to America from a small town in Slovenia, built her life from nothing, and never sought the spotlight. She wasn't just an image, she was a person who had fought her own battles, just as everyone did, though in ways no one could see. The thought of his mother being reduced to nothing more than a pretty face made his blood boil. Should he speak up? The room was filled with the sounds of laughter and debate, but no one knew the full story. If he didn't stand up, who would? Professor Lewis, seemingly unaware of the growing tension, smirked as she dug the knife in deeper. "We can admire someone's elegance all we want, but does it really change anything?" Her voice dripped with mockery. "If we're searching for true role models, why not talk about Michelle Obama or Eleanor Roosevelt? Women who actually made a difference, not someone who's just good for a photo op." Laughter rippled through the room once again, Jessica chuckling softly. Mark whispered to a friend, "If there are any Melania Trump fans here, they must be fuming right now." Barron's hands tightened into fists, his body trembling with the weight of words unspoken. This wasn't just about Melania. It was about what people overlooked, what they never bothered to understand. But for now, he stayed silent, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Barron, the quiet student from the third row, raised his hand. The moment felt almost surreal. Professor Lewis paused, her sharp eyes shifting towards him. A few heads turned, and a ripple of curiosity spread among the students. This was unexpected, a shift that no one had seen coming. Jessica couldn't help but whisper, "I've never heard him say a word before." Mark, sensing something important was unfolding, quickly started recording on his phone. Barron stood up, taking a deep breath. In that moment, something changed within him. He no longer cared who was watching, no longer worried about his secret being exposed. His gaze locked with Professor Lewis as he spoke, his voice calm but carrying a weight that resonated beyond the walls of the lecture hall. "Professor," Barron began, his words deliberate, "you've made an interesting point, but have you ever truly taken the time to understand who Melania Trump is? Or is it just the image the media has painted for you?" The room went still. Professor Lewis's brows furrowed, her composure slipping for just a second. No one in the room had expected this. Barron's voice, steady and resolute, echoed in the silence. Mark's grip tightened on his phone, unable to tear his eyes away. Jessica, her expression hardening, could feel the shift in the air. Something important was unfolding, and they were witnessing it. Professor Lewis, regaining her posture, folded her arms and regarded Barron with a mix of curiosity and challenge. "So you have something to add?" she asked sharply. Barron took another breath, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but unyielding, filled with something deeper. Conviction. "You talk about my mother as though she's just an image, a symbol of something hollow. But have you ever asked yourself what she's truly been through?" A stunned silence filled the room. Mark blinked, shocked. Did he just say, "My mother"? Jessica's mind raced, her thoughts scrambling to make sense of what she had just heard. Professor Lewis, now struggling to mask her surprise, replied with a hint of amusement. "Is that so? Then tell me, what do you want to say about Melania Trump?" Barron's gaze never wavered, his voice cutting through the tension with unwavering clarity. "My mother didn't grow up with wealth or privilege. She was born in a small town in Slovenia, a place where no one could have guessed she would one day walk through the doors of the White House. She learned English, worked tirelessly, and built her career as an international model. All from nothing." Curiosity began to stir among a few students, their attention sharpened. Jessica, who had always dismissed politics, felt an unexpected rush of emotion, her heart racing. She had never heard anyone speak of Melania Trump like this before. Professor Lewis studied Barron with narrowed eyes, but Barron, unfazed, pressed on. "My mother is often reduced to just a pretty image," he said, his voice steady. "But do you really know what she went through as First Lady? She was mocked, belittled, every expression analyzed, every outfit dissected, every movement criticized by the media. They painted her as someone in her husband's shadow, but has anyone ever taken the time to listen to her? Has anyone ever looked beyond the pictures the media chose to show and asked themselves, what has she really done? What does she stand for?" Barron's words, firm but not angry, carried something more: conviction, pride, and a quiet strength. The room grew still, and for the first time, Professor Lewis's confidence seemed to waver. She parted her lips, about to speak, but Barron continued before she could interrupt. "You say my mother launched the Be Best initiative, but it didn't make a difference." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Then ask the children who faced bullying. Ask the families struggling with online harassment. My mother never craved attention. She didn't parade in front of the camera to boast about her actions. But does that mean she did nothing?" Silence fell over the room. Mark leaned toward Jessica and whispered, "I've never seen Professor Lewis so quiet." Jessica, usually quick to argue, felt a shift inside her. She had always seen Melania Trump as a mere figurehead, a carefully constructed persona. But now, for the first time, doubt crept in. Barron's gaze swept across the room before returning to Professor Lewis. "We live in a world where judgment comes easily. We consume the stories the media feeds us, without ever asking, who are these people really? Behind every public figure is a real person, someone with hopes, struggles, and sacrifices." He let the silence linger, then locked eyes with the professor. "You say the media shapes how we see the world, but have you ever stopped to consider that maybe you too have been shaped by their narrative? Maybe they've shown you only what they wanted you to see." A heavy silence settled over the room. Jessica's mouth went dry, her thoughts tangled in a mix of shock and realization. Mark's hand gripped his phone tightly, the moment forever etched in time. Professor Lewis didn't speak right away, her eyes fixed on Barron, but the usual sharpness in her gaze had softened. The room felt frozen, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then, almost unexpectedly, she said, "Fair enough." Her voice was calm, measured, no longer cutting. "You've asked a question worth thinking about." It wasn't an apology, but an acknowledgement that cut through the tension. Mark finally lowered his phone. The recording stopped. Jessica sat back, arms crossed, her face a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. What had started as just another lecture had become something profound, something that no one in that room would ever forget. After class, Mark uploaded a video to TikTok with a simple caption that would soon ignite a firestorm online. A student silences an entire lecture hall and makes a professor rethink everything. Within hours, the video hit over 500,000 views. In just one day, it exploded, with news outlets, viral Twitter accounts, and influencers all sharing the moment. The world couldn't stop talking about it. An unknown student just made a renowned professor question her own biases. An unforgettable moment when truth can no longer be ignored. The identity of the student? It was Baron Trump. Curiosity spread like wildfire. People searched for answers, and his name was everywhere. This wasn't just a viral moment, it sparked a national conversation. Supporters praised Barron for his courage as he stood up for his mother, Melania Trump, in a way that resonated with many. He didn't just defend her, He exposed how easily biases shape our views. His message was clear: don't judge someone until you know the full story. But not everyone agreed. Critics quickly labeled it as a publicity stunt, dismissing it with harsh words. Melania Trump is still an empty figure, they said. This student is just overreacting. Yet, amid all the noise, something profound had happened. Days later, Professor Lewis took to Twitter to address the moment. As a professor, I've always taught my students to ask tough questions. But last week, one of them asked a question that made me rethink my own perspective. While my views on public figures haven't changed, I've learned an important lesson. No one should be judged by their surface image. Baron Trump, keep asking the tough questions, and I hope we all learn to listen more before we judge. Baron read her post and smiled. He didn't need an apology, nor did he expect her to change overnight. He only needed one moment to make people think. Jessica texted him, "You made Professor Lewis rethink her stance. Not everyone can do that." Baron's reply was simple. "I just wanted to remind people that some stories are worth listening to before jumping to conclusions." Mark messaged, "Hey, your video just hit 10 million views. Ready for your big moment?" Baron smiled again, typing back, "I don't need fame. I just want people to start thinking." 1 week later, when the lecture hall at Westwood University filled again, there were no mocking laughs or dismissive smirks. Students sat up, eager to hear what would come next. The moment Baron had created still lingered. Jessica leaned toward him, her voice curious. "What do you think Professor Lewis will say today?" Baron smiled softly, knowing the truth didn't need to be shouted, it only needed to be spoken at the right time. Professor Martha Lewis entered the classroom, but something was different about her. The usual sharpness in her eyes was gone, replaced by something softer, more introspective. She moved to the front, placed her things down, and then paused, looking around at her students. With a quiet, steady voice, she began, "Last week, one of you made me think in ways I hadn't before. I've always taught you to ask the right questions, but I forgot something important. Sometimes I need to question myself too." The room held its breath, every student feeling the weight of her words. We live in a world where information can be twisted so easily, and it's easy to judge someone based on what we see on the surface. But what I've learned this week is this: everyone has a story, and no one should ever be judged by the image we see of them. She turned her gaze toward Baron, a silent acknowledgement. "Thank you, Baron." The silence was palpable. Some students had suspected, but hearing her say it out loud was different. Mark couldn't hide his excitement, and Jessica's smile was full of admiration. After class, Baron stood in the hallway, letting the moment settle. He wasn't seeking recognition, but he knew something had shifted in that room, something that would stay with them. Jessica caught up with him, a playful grin on her face. "You made Professor Lewis rethink everything, didn't you?" Baron smirked but shook his head. "I didn't need to change her mind, just make her question it." Mark appeared, phone in hand. "Your video just hit 20 million views. Any thoughts for your new followers?" Baron laughed. "I don't have fans, Mark." He turned to the camera, his expression serious. "But if there's one thing I want everyone to take from this, it's this. Before you judge someone, make sure you know their full story." Baron's journey was never just about him. It was about the courage to stand up, to question, and above all, to listen before rushing to judgment. In a world where information is so often distorted, maybe it's time to pause, ask more, and listen deeper. Because behind every face, every name, there's a story waiting to be heard. Baron smiled, his words lingering in the air. "I don't need her to change completely. I just need her to start questioning her beliefs, and that's enough." Later, as Mark approached with his phone, Baron smiled softly. "Before you judge, make sure you understand the whole story. It's a reminder we all need. Behind every label, every surface, there's a real person with a life, a truth. And sometimes all it takes is a moment of curiosity to change how we see them. And if this story moved you, remember to like and subscribe. There's always more to every story than meets the eye. Thanks for watching. See you next time."